Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing way back, deep into the Triassic, to explore a really remarkable ancient creature, Asilisaurus conway.
Yeah, and we've got quite a bit to work with. Scientific papers, stuff about the discovery, the bones, even how it grew.
Exactly. And our mission really is to understand what Asilisaurus can tell us about those very early relatives of dinosaurs and pterosaurs.
It's a crucial piece, trying to figure out the roots of these major groups.
And Asilisaurus is special, isn't it? Found in Tanzania, Africa, potentially a very, very early branch on that whole dinosaur-pterosaur family tree.
hmm
Even the name gives away ancestor lizard in Swahili. That tells you something. Okay, let's dig in. Where did this story begin? The discovery.
Right, so the discovery itself happened back in 2007. It was in the Manda beds of Tanzania, specifically a spot called locality Z34, near Latumba and Diosi.
Okay.
And this whole area, the Lafua member of the Manda beds, it's like this amazing snapshot of a Middle Triassic lake ecosystem, just fantastic preservation.
And it wasn't just like a single tooth they found. Sounds like Z34 was pretty productive.
Oh, absolutely. A real bonanza, as you say. They found remains of at least 14 different Asilisaurus individuals just at that one site.
14. Wow.
Yeah, including the holotype that's the main reference specimen.
Right.
In this case, it's a lower jawbone, NMT RB9.
Sure.
But that wasn't all. More stuff, likely Asilisaurus, has been found scattered throughout the Manda beds since then.
So it seems like Asilisaurus was doing pretty well for itself back then. Maybe quite common.
Compared to, other non-dinosaurian dinosaur forms from that time, yes, definite. It seems relatively common in that specific ecosystem.
Right.
We even have fragments from younger ones probably found at another site, Z90, and significantly, a much better, more complete partial skeleton NMT RB159 was found at locality Z137. That one got described in detail in 2019, so lots of material helps.
Which brings us back to that name, Asilisaurus conway. Asili for ancestor, Sauros for lizard, conway for the species. Really points to its importance.
Exactly. That name came from the team led by Sterling Nesbitt and colleagues. They published the first big description in Nature back in 2010. They saw its potential right away, for shedding light on those early steps towards dinos and pterosaurs.
Okay, so we've got the where and when, the who named it.
Yeah.
Let's zoom out a bit. Where does Asilisaurus fit in the grand scheme of things? Classification, age.
Scientifically, okay, broad strokes, Eukaryota, Animalia, Chordata. It's an animal with a backbone, pretty standard stuff there. But then it gets, well, more interesting and a bit debated. You might see question marks next to Dinosauria, or even Ornithischia sometimes. There's a thought it could be really close to the origin of dinosaurs, maybe even linked somehow to the bird-hipped ones.
Ornithischia. Seriously, the bird-hipped lion. That's
It's
fascinating.
an implication, yeah.
Yeah.
But its definite spot right now is within Silosauridae, that group of non-dinosaur forms we mentioned.
Okay, Silosauridae. Got it. And how old are we talking?
So the Manda beds where it was found are generally dated to the Anisian age. That's Middle Triassic, which would put Asilisaurus living somewhere around 247 to 242 million years ago. That makes it one of the absolute oldest known members of Metatarsella.
Of the Metatarsalia, the big group, including dinos and pterosaurs.
Exactly. So right near the beginning of that major split.
Wow. But you mentioned some debate about the age.
Well, yeah, there are a few arguments suggesting maybe it's a bit younger, possibly early Carnian age, which is later in the Triassic, but the bulk of the evidence still points towards Anisian.
Okay.
But either way, Anisian or early Carnian, it's still incredibly significant as the first non-dinosaurian dinosaur form found in Africa.
And why is finding it in Africa such a big deal?
Well, it gives us solid proof for something we kind of suspected, that Metatarsella, the Dinopterosaur line, was diversifying really rapidly during the Middle Triassic.
Right.
Before Asilisaurus, most of the evidence for a big evolutionary burst around that time came from Pseudosuchians, the croc line. So Asilisaurus shows the other main branch was also branching out actively, diversifying, and importantly, doing it in Africa too. It wasn't just happening elsewhere.
So this ancestor lizard from Tanzania really shook things up.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try and picture it. What did Asilisaurus actually look like? Physically.
Okay, picture a relatively lightweight animal, probably walked on all fours, so quadrupedal.
Uh-huh.
It seems to have had a fairly long neck for an early archosaur, a noticeably short snout, likely ending in a beak, and quite slender limbs.
And size-wise.
Estimates vary, but generally somewhere between 1 to 3 meters long. That's about 3 to 10 feet. Hip height maybe half a meter to a meter, so roughly 2 to 3 feet tall at the hip.
Okay.
Weight-wise, maybe 10 to 30 kilograms. So 20 to 70 pounds, think medium-sized dog maybe.
That 3-meter upper end sounds quite a bit bigger than the 1-meter lower end. What's behind that bigger estimate?
Ugh, good question. That mainly comes from one specific bone, an incomplete femur, a thigh bone, catalog number NHMUK R16303. It was found in the mandibeds, and it's definitely silasaurid-like, but it is significantly larger than other Asilisaurus femurs.
So maybe not Asilisaurus.
There's some uncertainty, yeah. We can't definitively say it belongs to Asilisaurus. So that larger size estimate needs a little asterisk next to it. It could potentially be a different, bigger silasaurid species living nearby.
Right, the classic fossil puzzle.
Okay.
So generally smaller, lightly built. What about the nitty-gritty? Specific anatomical features that make it stand out.
Oh, it had quite a few unique things going on. Let's start with the skull. It was pretty short overall, small nostril openings, but really large, round eye sockets.
Okay.
And one really interesting bit is the premaxilla, that bone right at the front of the snout. It's large, but it's mostly toothless.
Toothless at the front.
Yeah, mostly. It had a sharp lower edge, a kind of pointed front tip, and only a single tooth way at the back of that bone. That's quite different from many other early dinosaur morphs that usually have teeth all along the premaxilla.
Huh. That's like an early experiment with a beak?
Kind of looks that way, yeah. Suggests maybe trying out different feeding strategies early on in this lineage.
And the lower jaw. Did it match?
Pretty much. The front part of the lower jaw, the dentary, was also toothless. And it had this distinct downward curve right at the tip.
Downward.
Yeah, which is actually unique among silasaurids. In the others, like Silosaurus, the tip usually curves upwards. Asilisaurus also just had fewer teeth in the lower jaw overall, maybe 8 to 10, and they didn't take up as much of the jaw length compared to its relatives.
Very distinct mouth setup then. What about the teeth it did have?
They were ankylossuccidont, meaning set in sockets, which is common for archosaurs like dinos and crocs, and they curved backwards, so recurved.
Serrated like steak knives.
Some specimens show teeth with really poorly developed serrations, almost smooth. Others have more prominent ones, so a bit variable there.
You mentioned the skull had some general similarities to others like Silosaurus. Where did it differ specifically?
Right, so overall shape has some resemblance to Silosaurus or Luosuchus, but differences. Okay, the prefrontal bone in front of the eye is quite large, has a distinct swelling. The back of the frontal bone has a depression called a supratemporal fossa. Now, that feature is interesting because we see it in Teleocritor and also in dinosaurs, but not in other silosaurids.
Ah, a dinosaur-like feature.
Exactly. And another one, the quadrate bone at the back hinge of the jaw, partly overlaps the squamosal bone above it. That's also something seen in dinosaurs, but not typically in other silosaurids.
So it really is this mosaic, isn't it? Some primitive bits, some features pointing towards dinosaurs. What about the backbone?
Yeah, the vertebrae show that mix too. The neck vertebrae, the cervicals, were sort of parallelogram-shaped, moderately long, similar to other silosaurids. They didn't have the really deep pits and ridges you see in silosaurs. But some Asilisaurus neck bones show small bumps called epipophyses. We see those in early critters called aphanosaurs and also in dinosaurs, but they're gone in more advanced silosaurids.
Interesting. And the back vertebrae?
The dorsals, yeah. They were shorter, more complex looking. They lacked those epipophyses, but did have hypophosphene.
Hyposphenes.
Yeah, those are extra joints that help stiffen the spine, another feature shared with dinosaurs.
Okay.
And it had 2 sacral vertebrae in the hips, each connecting to its own rib. That's different from Silosaurus, which had more fused together sharing ribs. And the tail vertebrae got longer further down the tail, which is pretty typical for dinosaur forms.
Right. Okay. Let's move to the limbs. Arms, legs, shoulders, hips. What do they tell us?
Okay, the shoulder blade, the scapula, was long and narrow, triangular tip. No holes or anything unusual there. The humerus, the upper arm bone, was pretty straight, only slightly twisted. It had some features like a relatively small delta pectoral crest, that muscle attachment ridge, that are actually unlike what you see in most dinosaurs.
Okay, so not quite dinosaur-like there.
Right. Lower arm bones, radius and ulna. Pretty simple. Radius was thin, shorter than the humerus. Ulna had a big olecranon process, that's the bony point of the elbow. And based on one tiny hand bone, a metacarpal, it looks like the hand was probably much shorter than the foot.
Okay, and the all-important hips and legs.
Yeah.
Crucial for figuring out movement and relationships.
Absolutely. So the hip socket, the acetabulum, it was closed. A solid bony cup, that's a key difference from dinosaurs, which famously have an open, hole-like acetabulum.
Right, the perforated hip socket is a dino hallmark.
Exactly. But the ilium, the main upper hip bone, did have something called a brevis fossa underneath its back end, bordered by ridges, kind of like the brevis shelf in dinosaurs. The other hip bones, ischium and pubis, looked a bit like those in another early one, Suchosaurus.
And the femur, the thigh bone.
The femur had a lot of standard dinosaur form features, a groove on the head, an antitrochanterica projection, 3 bumps near the top called tubera, and anterior trochanter, so definitely in that group. But it lacked some features seen in more advanced silosaurids. And another projection, the dorsolateral trochanter, wasn't very well developed compared to many dinosaurs. Still kind of intermediate.
It really hammers home that transitional nature. Lower leg and foot. Any clues there?
Yeah, the tibia and fibula, the lower leg bones, looked similar to other dinosaur forms, but importantly, they were shorter than the femur.
Which is different from early dinosaurs.
Generally, yes. In many basal dinosaurs, the tibia is often as long as, or even longer than, the femur, so that's another difference. The ankle was what we call a primitive crurotarsal type.
Meaning?
Think of it as a simpler hinge, kind of like a crocodile ankle, where the astragalus and calcaneum bones fit together with a convex concave joint. The calcaneum, the heel bone, looked a bit like that of Teleocrator, another important early relative.
Okay.
While the astragalus, the main ankle bone, resembled that of Marsuchus, which is considered very, very close to actual dinosaurs. Again, that mix.
And the foot itself.
It was shorter than in some other silosaurs, but still pretty long overall. The middle toe bone, the third metatarsal, was the longest. Interestingly, the fifth metatarsal, the outer one, wasn't tiny or vestigial like it is in many later dinosaur morphs. It was still functional.
And the claws.
The ungalls, yeah, the bones at the very tips of the toes, they were low and wide, almost hoof-like. Similar to what you see in Silosaurus and some totally unrelated early archosaurs, actually.
Wow. Okay. This detailed anatomy paints a picture of a truly fascinating mosaic creature. It's holding on to some old traits, but clearly showing off features that point towards the future dinosaurs and pterosaurs.
Right.
Right. Let's shift gears slightly. How did this animal actually live? What about its paleobiology? Diet, maybe?
Yeah, the diet is interesting. The evidence points towards it being either an omnivore or possibly a herbivore.
What's the evidence?
Well, that beak structure at the front we talked about, plus the peg-like teeth further back. That combination suggests it could process plants, maybe snipping with the beak and grinding further back, kind of like later plant-eating dinosaurs.
Okay, makes sense.
But the shape of the teeth themselves, being kind of conical, also looks a bit like the teeth you see in some reptiles that eat fish.
So maybe fish too.
It's possible. So omnivore seems plausible, or maybe primarily herbivore with some occasional other food items. What seems unlikely is that it was a specialized hunter of large animals or a strict, couldn't eat anything else herbivore, probably quite adaptable.
A flexible diet could definitely be an advantage. Okay, what about how it grew up? Can the fossils tell us about its development?
They can, actually. Studies looking at lots of Asilisaurus thigh bones, the femora, noticed there seemed to be 2 main shapes. Some looked more slender, others more robust.
Ah, like male and female differences. Sexual dimorphism.
That was the initial thought, yeah, because people had seen similar variations in other early dinosaur relatives and suggested it might be sexes. But a really detailed study in 2016 looked closely at a whole bunch of these Asilisaurus femora. And they looked at the sequence of how different muscle scars appeared on the bones as the animal presumably grew. They found that instead of 2 distinct groups consistently linking shape to size, there was actually a lot of individual variation in how these scars developed.
So not necessarily male and female, but maybe. Just different growth stages.
That seems to be the much more likely explanation. Now, yes, the robust femurs probably belong to older, more mature individuals where the muscles had pulled more on the bone, causing more remodeling. The slender ones likely came from younger, less mature animals.
Okay.
And interestingly, they didn't find a super strong link between just the overall size of the bone and how mature it looked based on those scars. Some smaller, robust bones looked more developed than bigger, slender ones.
Huh. So growth rate wasn't perfectly tied to just getting bigger.
It suggests other things might have played a role, maybe food availability or other environmental factors influencing how quickly individuals reached skeletal maturity, independent of just their overall size. It's more complex than just big, old, small, young.
That adds a lot of nuance. Did they look inside the bones, too? Bone histology?
They did, yeah. Thin sections of the long bones, femur, humerus, tibia, fibula under the microscope, showed a type of bone tissue called woven fibered cortex with lots of longitudinal canals running through it.
And what does that tell us?
That structure is generally seen as intermediate. It's faster growing than the very layered bone you see in, say, modern crocodiles, but maybe not quite as fast or disorganized as the bone in many dinosaurs. The density of bone cell cavities, the osteocyte lacunae, was pretty typical for dinosauromorphs.
Okay, intermediate growth speed. Anything else?
Crucially, they didn't find any lags, lines of arrested growth.
Lags, those are like tree rings and bones, right?
Yeah.
Showing periods where growth slowed or stopped, often due to seasons.
Exactly. And their absence, even in the largest Asilisaurus bones they looked at, suggests something important.
Which is?
It suggests that Asilisaurus probably grew at a moderately high rate and quite constantly. Its growth likely wasn't significantly interrupted by harsh seasons or long periods of food scarcity.
So growing steadily.
Yeah, relatively quickly and steadily for its time. Still slower than early dinosaurs, probably, but definitely faster than more primitive archosaurs. And the lack of ags doesn't mean they all died in their first year or something. Their estimated growth rate suggests it would take longer than a year to reach full size anyway.
Fascinating. So a fairly quick grower, steady pace, already showing some biological traits that would become even more pronounced later on.
Yeah.
Okay, we have definitely gone deep into the world of Asilisaurus conway. Let's try and pull these threads together for some final thoughts.
Yeah, to sum it up, Asilisaurus really gives us these incredibly valuable glimpses into the early evolution, that early diversification of the lineage leading to dinosaurs and pterosaurs right back in the Middle Triassic. And its unique mix of features, some primitives, some derived, some just plain odd, like that downturned jaw, helps us connect the dots across a really important gap in the fossil record.
For me, the big aha is still that African discovery. It just underscores that this early burst of the metatarsalian evolution wasn't confined to, say, South America. It seems to have been happening much more rapidly and across a wider geographic area, including Africa, than we maybe appreciated before.
Absolutely.
And the specific features we see in Asilisaurus help us sort of define the toolkit that existed before all the classic dinosaur traits really locked in.
And that really leads to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to ponder. How does a creature like Asilisaurus, with this patchwork of traits, this intermediate growth, challenge our perhaps overly simple, linear ideas about evolution?
Right. It wasn't just step A to step B to dinosaur.
Exactly. It suggests a much more complex, branching, experimental process in the early days of dinosaur relatives. So the question is, what other creatures like Asilisaurus, what other evolutionary experiments might still be out there, buried, waiting to be found, and reshape our understanding even further?